Kofi Mensah had pulled things from the water his whole life. Nets, traps, the occasional piece of timber that washed in from somewhere upstream and could be sold for firewood. But he had never pulled a person. It was a Saturday in March, at 4:47 in the afternoon, when the tide on the Pra River was doing what it did in March, moving fast and brown and without apology, carrying with it everything the recent rains had loosened from the bank. He was in his canoe, a 14-foot vessel he had built in 2009, with his uncle Quadro, who was now dead, and who had taught him that the joints between planks were either honest or they were not, and that the water would eventually find out which. He was 300 meters from the bank, tending his second net of the day, when he heard something that was not the river. The Pra is loud in March. It does not share its noise with other sounds easily. For a man to hear something distinct from it at 4:47 on a Saturday afternoon, the sound had to be urgent in a specific way. He saw her before he fully understood what he was seeing. She was 40 meters downstream, moving in the way that a person moves when the water has already decided the question and they are arguing with it anyway, arms breaking the surface irregularly, no rhythm. The head going under and coming back and going under again at intervals that were growing longer. She was wearing something dark. She had hair that spread around her when she surfaced, and her mouth opened each time in a shape that was more prayer than sound. Kofi Mensah had been paddling a canoe since he was 11 years old, which meant he had been paddling for 29 years, which meant that the calculation of angle, current, and speed required to close 40 meters in a river running at March volume was not a calculation he made consciously. He made it the way a person makes a calculation they have rehearsed without intending to. He reached her in 90 seconds. She was not easy to bring into the canoe. A drowning person is not passive. The body fights water even when the mind has stopped being sure it should, and she gripped his left arm with both hands in a way that nearly capsized them. He spoke to her the whole time, not in full sentences, but in the low, even tones he used with the net when it was tangled, with the canoe when the current was wrong, with the sky when it looked uncertain. He said, "I have you. I have you. Stay still." He said it in Fonte because that was the language that came when he needed a language to come quickly. She was over the side and into the canoe floor at 4:49. He did not look at her closely then. He paddled. He brought the canoe to shore at the landing where he always brought it in, at the foot of the slope that led up to the edge of Asamkau, the village of 340 people on the western bank of the Pra, where he had been. Born and had lived every one of his 40 years except for 8 months. In Takoradi, in 2011, when he had tried working at a fish processing facility and found that being inside a building all day did something. 2. Him that he could not fully articulate, but that he did not wish to continue. He pulled the canoe up, which was harder than usual, because she was still in it and weighed what a person weighs when they are soaked through. And then he helped her out. She sat on the bank for 11 minutes. He sat beside her and said nothing, because there is a category of silence that is more useful than anything that can be said. When she spoke in Twi first, then English, then Twi again, as though she was not sure which language the situation required. She said she had been on the road above the river, the road that ran along the bluff north of Asamkau, the one used by long-haul trucks and the occasional private vehicle, and that her car had left the road. She said it in pieces. She said the car was in the river. She said she did not know how far from where he found her. She said her name was Zainab. She did not say her surname. He did not ask. She was perhaps 45, he thought, though he had always been imprecise about ages in the same way he was imprecise about the names of plants. He knew their functions without needing their formal titles. She was wearing, even soaked, clothes that cost more than anything he owned. Her shoes, which he helped her remove because they had filled with river water, were leather, and even in their current condition communicated that she was accustomed to a particular kind of floor. She had a watch on her left wrist, a small rectangular face on a dark strap, and when he helped her stand, the watch caught the late afternoon light. He took her to his house. His house was the third building from the river on the left side of the main path through Asamkow. It had 2 rooms, a covered porch, and a corrugated iron roof that he had replaced in 2021 using money from an unusually good season. Inside the front room there was a table, 2 chairs, a kerosene lamp, a radio that received 4 stations clearly and 2 others with interference, and a small shelf on which there were 7 books, 3 of which had been his mother's, and 4 of which he had bought himself over the years without any particular system. The floor was swept concrete. The walls were painted a color that had started as yellow and had become, over the years, a color that was between yellow and the memory of yellow. He gave her dry clothes that had belonged to his mother, which he kept in a trunk in the second room, and which he had not given away when she died in 2019, because he had not arrived at the decision about what to do with them. He heated water and made tea from a tin that was almost empty. He gave her the chair closest to the lamp, because it was the least uncomfortable. She said, "I need to make a phone call." He said, "There was no signal in Asamkow." This was the central geographical fact of the village's relationship with the wider world. The network was available at a point 2.3 kilometers north on the Bluff Road, which was also where her car had left it, and at a point 4 kilometers south where the road widened near the junction to Twyfo. He said he would drive her to the junction in the morning, if she needed. He said it in the matter-of-fact tone he used for practical things. She looked at him for a moment. "In the morning," she said. "Unless you want to walk 4 kilometers in the dark," he said. This was not humor exactly. It was simply the accurate description of the alternative. She did not walk 4 kilometers in the dark. She ate the food he made, a stew of tomatoes and smoked fish that he had been planning to eat himself, with rice from a bag that had perhaps 6 more servings left in it. And she ate it in the quiet way of a person who has recently been in the Pra River in March and found themselves reconsidering the relative importance of various things. He ate across the table from her. The radio played something faint and indistinct. The lamp threw shadows that moved slightly in the draft from the window gap. She asked him about the village. He told her, 340 people, 2 primary school classes that shared 1 teacher since the second teacher left in January and had not been replaced. A clinic that was staffed on Tuesdays and Fridays by a nurse from Twyfo who came by motorcycle, a road that was technically maintained by the district authority but had not had grading work done since 2022, and a river that was the reason the village existed and the reason several people had left it. He said all of this the way he said most things, without editorializing, as though he were reading coordinates. She listened. At some point she asked him, "What do you need here?" He looked at her. "I'm not asking to be polite," she said. "I'm asking because I want to know." He thought about it. He was not accustomed to the question. People from outside Asamkow asked occasionally about the village. Journalists once, from a regional paper. A student doing a survey for a university program. A development worker who had come with a questionnaire and left with data. But the question was usually framed differently. It was usually, "What are the challenges?" or "What are the deficits?" Those questions assumed a position from which one assessed things as lacking. Her question was structured differently. "What do you need?" It assumed he knew. He said, "A second teacher. A road that the ambulance from Twyfo could use without losing its suspension. A generator for the clinic. because the Tuesday nurse could not run the equipment she needed to run without one, and so did not. A net repair facility with proper lighting so the men did not do the repair work on hooks and sinkers in the dark and lose fingers, which had happened once in 2023 to a man named Dubem, who was now careful with his right hand in a new way. He said these things simply, in the order they came to him. She took out nothing to write them down with. She had no phone, no notebook. These were in the river along with her car. But he had the impression, watching her face while he spoke, that she was recording them in a way that did not require a notebook. She slept on the floor of the second room on a mat he laid out, with a blanket he had not used since his mother stopped visiting from Twyfo in 2018. He slept in the front room. The river was audible through the walls, which it always was in March. In the morning, he drove her to the junction on his motorcycle, a machine that was 16 years old and had 147,000 kilometers on it, and which still ran because he understood the reasons things stopped running and addressed them before they became those reasons. At the junction, she stood at the roadside and held his phone. He had a phone, which worked at the junction, for 4 minutes and spoke in a low voice and then returned it to him. She said, "Someone is coming." He said he would wait. She said, "You do not need to wait." He said it was not a trouble. They waited 31 minutes. The vehicle that came was black and large and moved with the quiet assurance of a vehicle that had never had to negotiate its own priority. A man got out, young, in a white shirt, holding another phone, and spoke to her in a rapid English that was also partly something else, and then looked at Kofi once with an expression that was not unfriendly, but also had not yet decided what to do with him. She said something to the man. The man nodded. She turned to Kofi. She said his name, which she had learned the previous evening, and which she now said with a particular precision, the way people say names when they want to make sure the other person understands the name has been retained. She said, "I am going to send someone back here." He said, "You do not need to." She said, "I know I do not need to." She paused. "That is not what I said." The car left. He drove back to Asamkal on the 147,000-kilometer motorcycle. He went to his second net and found it had taken in 3 good fish overnight and 1 piece of timber that had come from somewhere upstream. He processed the fish. He sold the timber. He ate in the evening and listened to the radio. He did not speak about the previous afternoon to anyone in the village, partly because the village had its own rhythms and did not need his additions, and partly because he was not certain what had happened was something with the next chapter. He was wrong about that. If you can feel where this is going, stay with me. What happens over the next 3 weeks changes everything about what that Tuesday nurse was able to do with her motorcycle and her equipment. 9 days after the morning at the junction, a man arrived in Asimkau in a white vehicle with the logo of a district engineering firm on the door. He walked the main path through the village, took measurements at 4 points on the road, wrote things in a clipboard folder, and left. He returned 2 days later with 2 other people. Kofi watched this from his porch and said nothing. On the 14th day after the junction, 2 things happened on the same morning. The first was that a grading machine appeared at the south entrance to the village road at 7:03 a.m. and began doing what grading machines do, which is to say it began making the road into something an ambulance could use without losing its suspension. The second was that a phone call came to the village chief, a man named Al, Chief Urenki, 71 years old, whose phone worked because he stood in a specific spot near the North Baobab tree, and the call was from an office in Accra. And the call was about a secondment arrangement for a qualified teacher to a Simcoe primary for a period of 12 months, renewable, beginning the first week of April. Chief Urenki came to find Kofi at the river. He said, "Do you know what this is about?" Kofi said, "I am not certain." He said this because he was genuinely not certain. He had said 4 things at a table in his house to a woman in his mother's dry clothes, and he had not been certain she had written them down. And he had not been certain, even if she had written them down, that the writing down would become anything. He had learned in 40 years that the distance between the recording of a problem and the addressing of it was usually large enough to misplace a person in. He had been wrong about that too. On the 19th day, a generator arrived at the clinic on the back of a flatbed from Twyfo. It was a 5-kilowatt unit, adequate for the equipment the Tuesday nurse needed to run, and it came with a 90-day fuel arrangement already invoiced to a logistics address in Accra. The clinic nurse, a woman named Pauline, who had been driving her motorcycle from Twyfo every Tuesday and Friday since 2021, and who had learned to carry only the equipment she could use without power, because there had been no other option, arrived the following Tuesday and stood in the doorway of the clinic for a moment before she went inside and turned things on that had not been on before. On the 23rd day, Kofi was repairing his net on the bank at 11:08 in the morning when he heard a sound that was not the river. He was accustomed, by now, to the sounds that were not the river. The grading machine had been one, the flatbed from Twyfo had been another. But this sound was larger and came from above, and when he looked up, he saw 2 helicopters descending toward the flat ground north of the village where children played football on Saturday afternoons. The village came out. This was not a considered decision. 340 people do not hold a meeting about whether to observe 2 helicopters landing. They simply came, in the way that remarkable things draw people, until there was a loose assembly of most of a Semcow standing at a distance from the flat ground as the machine settled. She stepped out of the second helicopter. She was not wearing his mother's clothes. She was wearing what she had presumably worn before the road above the Pra River had offered her to the March water. A suit. Dark, with something precise about the cut that he could see even from 40 meters. She had 2 people with her, and she was speaking to them as she walked, and then she stopped speaking to them because she had seen him. She walked to where he was standing. The village was very quiet in the way that 340 people can be quiet when they are all present. She said, "I found the net repair problem harder to solve than the others." He said, "It is a specific problem." She said, "I am going to need you to help me understand it properly." She paused. "That is why I came back in person." Her name, which he now knew because Chief Urenkia had been told by the office in Accra when they called, was Zinab Owusu Boateng. Not Owusu Boateng like the restaurant man. A different family, a different lineage, a different kind of building. She was the chief executive of a logistics and rural development company that operated across 7 countries, the kind of company whose name appeared on white vehicles and on the sides of facilities in places that did not have facilities until the company arrived. She had been driving herself on the bluff road above the Pra because she had given her driver the day off and did not always remember that roads that looked manageable in the dry season did not remain manageable in March. She had been in the water for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the canoe reached her, which she knew because she had looked at the watch afterward, and it was still running, which had surprised her. She had taken his 4 things: a teacher, a road, a generator, a lit repair facility, and she had treated them the way she apparently treated every problem she encountered, which was to say as a question of logistics rather than charity. What resources exist? What is the most direct path between those resources and the need? And what is the first step? He showed her the net repair area that afternoon. a section of covered ground near the water that had been used for repair work for 30 years, and which had one suspended lamp that cast light on approximately 40% of the work surface. He showed her where the hooks were kept, and the sinkers, and the splice cord, and the place on the wooden frame where Dubem had caught his hand in 2023. She asked questions that were specific. She looked at the ceiling. She asked about the electrical infrastructure in the village, which he answered accurately if briefly, because the answer was brief. She said 2 weeks. He said, for the lights? She said, for the whole repair station. Proper benching, tool storage, lighting on a circuit that connects to the clinic generator in the off hours. She said it the way he said things, without making a point of them. The generator is oversized for the clinic's needs anyway. The load capacity is available. He looked at her. He said, "You thought about the generator before you arrived." She said, "I think about things before I arrive. It is usually faster." The 2 helicopters stayed on the flat ground for 3 hours. She met Chief Urenki, who offered her palm wine in the calabash he kept for occasions of significance, and she drank it without any particular performance of appreciation or deprecation, which Chief Urenki noted approvingly afterward. She walked the whole road from South Entrance to North Baobab. She spoke with Pauline at the clinic. She sat on the bank for a while, near the place where the canoe was pulled up, and looked at the prow in the specific way of a person who has recently been inside it and now finds themselves on the outside of it, looking in. Before she left, she stood with Kofi on the bank. She said, "The car is somewhere in there." She meant the river. "I have not sent anyone to retrieve it." He said, "It is not retrievable. The current in March deposits things 3 to 4 kilometers south before it lets go of them." She said, "Is that what happened to the timber you sell?" He looked at her. She said, "You mentioned timber in passing last night. I was curious about the source." He said, "Upstream. The March floods take wood from structures. The river brings it here." She said, "And you knew where to find it?" He said, "I know where the river puts things." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most useful thing I have heard anyone say in a long time." She said it simply, without flattery, the way she said everything. "I mean it practically. The rivers in this region move more than timber. Knowing where the current deposits things, that is geographic intelligence that most of our routing models are missing." He did not know what routing models were. He said so. She said, "I will explain. But not today." She looked at the water. "I need you to have a phone that works without going to the junction first." He said, "I have a phone." She said, "I mean a phone with a satellite connection. I will send one." The phone came 4 days later, along with a note that said, "Call me when you want to explain the river." The net repair station was completed in 16 days, not 14, a delay caused by a supplier delivering the wrong gauge of conduit wire, which she resolved from Accra with a phone call at 7:11 a.m. on a Thursday that Kofi was present for because she had called him first to explain what was happening and why it would take 2 more days. He had not expected to be told about the conduit wire. He found, when he thought about it, that being told about the conduit wire mattered to him in a way he would have found difficult to explain if asked. The lighting in the repair station came on for the first time on a Wednesday evening in April at 6:38 p.m. 8 men sat in the new light and repaired nets for 2 hours. Dubem worked with his right hand in the way he had before 2023. Nobody made a formal event of it. The river ran outside, the light ran along the full work surface, and there were no shadows in the corners where the hooks were kept. Over the following months, Kofi spoke with Zainab Owusu Botong 9 times on the satellite phone. 6 of the conversations were about the river. about the specific patterns of what it carried, where it deposited things, at what stages of the seasonal cycle, with what variation by volume and temperature. She had, he came to understand, a team that worked on infrastructure routing in river-adjacent communities, and the team had been working with incomplete information about how the rivers themselves moved. He did not think of what he told her as expertise. He thought of it as observation. He had been observing the Pra River for 29 years, and it had not occurred to him that this was information anyone would travel by helicopter to acquire. He was wrong about that too, which was becoming, he noted, a pattern. In August, she asked if he would come to Accra. She said there was a meeting about a river corridor project that would affect 6 communities on the Pra, and that she wanted him in the room. He said he had never been in a meeting in Accra. She said, "This one will be better for having you in it." He went. He sat in a room with 9 people, most of whom had degrees and wore certain clothes and used language that had more layers in it than he was accustomed to. He said 4 things in 2 hours. Each time he spoke, the room became slightly quieter in the way that rooms become quiet when something has been said that reorganizes the previous 40 minutes. At the end of the meeting, a woman with a degree from somewhere asked him where he had studied, and he said, "The Pra River since 1997. She laughed. He had not meant it as a joke. He understood, afterward, that this was not a problem. Asemkau, by the end of that year, had a second teacher, a functioning clinic with a generator, a road that had been graded twice, a lit repair station, and a man who held a satellite phone and occasionally said things in Accra that reorganized rooms. It also had, still, 340 people, a river that ran fast in March, and a 14-foot canoe with joints that were honest because Kwadwo had taught him that the water would eventually find out which. The helicopter had not brought these things. The plate of eggs was the woman in the restaurant. In this story, it was a canoe moving 90 seconds across March water without a conscious calculation, because the calculation was already inside the hands that held the paddle. The return, the teachers and generators and lit rooms and river meetings in Accra, these were not rewards. They were what happens when a person who has something essential is finally asked what it is. There is a version of generosity that is transactional. It extends help and waits to see what comes back. Kofi Mensah paddled 90 seconds in a river that did not want to give something back, brought a person to shore, made her tea from a tin that was almost empty, and then said nothing to anyone about it. That is not the version that ends in helicopters, but it is the version that has always been happening, in villages of 340 people on rivers that nobody has mapped, carried by people who have been observing the water for 29 years and have not been asked yet what they see. He did not save her because he knew who she was. He saved her because she was in the water at 4:47 in the afternoon, and he was 300 meters away, and his hands already knew what to do. That is the whole of it. The rest is what the world does when it finally pays attention. Here is the question I want to leave with you today. If you had spent your whole life building knowledge that nobody had ever thought to ask about, real knowledge, hard-won, the kind that only comes from watching the same river for 3 decades, what would it take for you to believe it was worth offering? And if someone came by helicopter to find out, would you have given them the same 4 sentences you gave at a table by lamplight, with no guarantee they were listening? Stories like this one are why this channel exists. Every week we tell one story about a person the world underestimated, told in full, at the pace it deserves, for an audience that knows the difference between a real story and a summary of one. If that is what you are here for, subscribe now. We are not here to rush anything. I'll see you in the next one.